Hi, welcome back to Burning River Bushcraft. Today we're going to be doing a review on the Campcraft Lieutenant Colonel. So this is a knife I have a ton of experience with. This is made by Rocky Woodland Forge. This is a smaller version of Jason Hunt's Colonel knife. Now I did a review on the Colonel already. I'm not going to do that again. It's just a beast of a knife. It's ridiculous. It's like 2 inches wide. My version is an 1/8 inch thick steel. Brad Holman's heat treat is just badass. I batoned the thing through a house in the video. If you haven't seen it, it's entertaining to watch me swing a stick into a knife for a half hour. But anywho, this is a shorter, more belt-worthy, reasonable option, in my opinion. By shrinking the big Colonel down, this knife is a lot handier. This is probably like 1.5 inches wide. This blade is right at 5 inches, I believe. I don't have a tape measure with me. That's not this type of review. But this was my main belt knife for several years. So there is currently a Lieutenant Colonel being made. I haven't personally seen it. Different manufacturer along the same lines as this knife. But this knife here is a freaking beast. Absolutely love it. It's a full hand grip. Kind of similar to the French trade style knife, but it's a little bit bigger right in here. A little bit bigger than some of the other knives, specifically like the Pathfinder knife, the PLSK1. That knife had a tendency to roll in my hands. This one still has its edges, so it hasn't been completely rolled over. It's not a hard edge at all, but it just locks into my hand a whole lot better. So for me in my hand, this grip is a huge improvement over some of the other French trade style knives that are out there. So this knife's got the black scale finish, so it's right out of the forge. It gives it that primitive look. It looks really nice with the brown micarta. A couple guys had different color handles. I always am kind of partial to this one, kind of partial to the brown. Spent tons and tons and tons of time with this 5-inch blade. A 5-inch blade like this is what really got me locked into the 5-inch. I completely owned this knife. I knew everything I could do with it. I knew what I couldn't do with it. A 5-inch blade like this, I can rock back a little bit. I have had lanyards on here in the past. I've used them to lightly debranch limbs. That's about the most chopping you're going to get with one of these. They really shine when you add a baton to it and start using that as a force amplifier to split wood. So performance on this knife is really no surprise. It's good steel. It's a comfortable grip. Scandinavian grind, 1/8 inch blade. It'll do the fine stuff as well as, you know, any of the notches and things that are required for shelter building or making trap components or anything like that. So here's a little notch I did with this. This thing notches and feathers pretty much like you think it would. So in other knife review videos, I always show the sheath, and it's part of a system, and I do like a system. This knife, you can tell how much I used it just by the wear and tear on the sheath. It's got that awesome, you know, scratched up look to it. Definitely looks like it's been drugged through briars and through mud and through water and everything else, which it has. Super deep sheath. It's broken to the point where it's almost getting too loose. I could probably re-wet form this, but right now this thing has been kind of broke down. I had a 1/2 inch ferro rod on this. I'm a fan of ferro rod loops on knives, and this I used an outer belt for quite a few years. So one of the main reasons I went with a secondary belt is at the time I was really focused on friction fire, so I would bow drill nearly every day. I had my fire kit with me. I burned everything on the property that was flammable. So I was experimenting, trying a lot of different things, working on my techniques. Fire is an important one to master. So I would just take this, and a lot of times if I was just going out to practice, I'd just throw it over my shoulder, you know, walk out into the woods, and I had my knife, I had my ferro rod, and my full fire kit with me at all times. So as usual, rather than just carve a bunch of silly things, I'm going to use this knife as it was intended, and I'm going to carve a trap with it. So I'm going to be using this knife only to carve a reverse figure 4. So if you're interested in seeing more of this knife or seeing how I carve a reverse figure 4, go ahead and check out the link to my other video. So no knife is perfect, so I'm going to go over some pros and cons of this knife. First, with the pros is the size. A 5-inch belt knife is just about ideal in my opinion. If you're going to have a knife on your belt, you're going to take up the space, and you're going to commit to having a knife strapped to your waist, a 5-inch knife is of just about an ideal size. Sticking with the pros, the grip is just about the right size. It's a full hand size, not too short, not where I'm just holding on to it. Lets me roll my hand back just a little bit if I need to get a swing, but again, with a 5-inch knife, you're really not going to be swinging it that effectively anyway. So another pro is the steel. So this is 1/8 inch Scandi Grind 5160. Brad's heat treat on this 5160 is pretty awesome, pretty badass stuff. I've never really chipped or rolled any of his knives. It holds an edge absolutely fantastically, and with my external belt, I would put a little bit of stropping compound on this, and just a quick hit in the field, and it was back to razor sharp again. So my cons are pretty small on this knife. This knife is a primitive style knife with the forging on it still, with the fire forge left on it. The handle contour is a little coarse. It is, if it was too rounded, that would be bad. This is almost too sharp. The back edges probably more than the front. Also, some of the fit and finish is not the best. You can see different scratch marks and grind marks from the grinder. I'm not a guy that cares about that. With a knife like this, this thing's going to be in the field and in use. If you're buy a knife and set it on a shelf and look how pretty it is, this is probably not the knife for you. The micarta has held up great. This doesn't have a butt cap on it, but I've beat the living snot out of this thing. I've used this to drive into things, to make splits in wood. No complaints functionality wise, but it is not as refined as some other knives. So most of these knives came with an in-house Campcraft sheath at the time. This one was not. This is a dangler, and I like the dangler. I'm a fan of it as far as not, catching and letting me move around when I'm in the woods and stuff. The negative aspect to it is that it's a freaking dangler. So I like it, and I don't like it about certain things too. You can see I'm starting to rip through some of my thread. Anytime I wear this, setting traps or doing anything around water, I'm submerging, a couple inches of trap on a pretty regular basis. So this thing gets drug around a lot. You can see, like I said, I've kind of lost my retention. That's no real fault of the knife. That's just, a leather sheath that's been used. Another negative, in my opinion, is I do my best work with a straight knife. So this French trade style knife, it is not as much of a drop point as some of the others out there. It skins well, it slices well for me, but if I'm doing a lot of camp carving type task, this is really not the knife that I prefer to have. I've used it, I've adapted to it. It feels comfortable in my hand. It feels like an extension of my hand. But if I'm going to just sit down all day and carve things, this is probably not going to be the blade shape that I would choose. All right, so this is the reverse figure 4. Again, if you want to see how I carve it, go ahead and check out the other video. It was done with only the Campcraft Lieutenant Colonel. Super awesome knife. Again, this is not a real challenge. A few basic notches is all you need for most primitive trapping. So all my knives I've graded out on a scale of 1 to 10. This thing is probably going to be a 9. It is just one of those knives I spent so much time with, and it just feels completely comfortable in my hand. I don't have fine hands anyway. I've kind of got some nerve damage in my hands, and I've got calluses and everything else. So if a knife is too slick, it doesn't work out that well for me. I need something to lock it into my hand. These squared edges are slightly squared, but not too bad. So after all day, it's probably not the greatest, but for realistic, real-world knife use, it fits my hand great. So not perfect. The Skookum was about the only one that I could have that in my hand and I'm not even aware of it sometimes. I could drink a cup of coffee and in between carving something. This knife drops to my hand naturally with this cut. Feels real good to me, but it's just not something that I'm unaware of. So I'll go on record and say any knife made by Brad Holman at Rocky Woodland Forge, I would trust it. So any knife that he has made or you see new or used, I would definitely pick it up. And any knife with the Campcraft logo that is something Jason's going to put his name on is something you can count on. Like I said, I have not seen the new Lieutenant Colonel. It looks very similar in shape. Little tweaks here and there that's different. I'm sure if I picked it up after spending just a little bit of time with it, it would become very familiar to my hand. But definitely, if you ever get to see the old school Lieutenant Colonel, check it out.